She thought she had lived through the worst life could throw at her, until the day he came home. A billionaire, faded everywhere except in the one place that needed him most. He had no idea his own mother and little girl had been living in the shadows, surviving on leftovers, and none treated as invisible in a world that never stops to ask their names. And when he saw them bent over a trash bin, everything he thought he knew about success, family, and justice shattered in that second. But how did they end up there? And who made sure he never knew the truth? Before the world knew his name, before the headlines called him a genius, Adrian had grown up in a small neighborhood where survival felt like a daily test. His mother worked double shifts, and his daughter, born when he was young and overwhelmed, was raised quietly in the background of his rise. When opportunity finally came, he ran toward it with everything he had, convinced that success meant escaping the weight of his past. And for years, it worked. Adrian built an empire that dazzled the public. Investments, partnerships, endless praise. But behind the cameras and applause was a truth he never questioned. He thought his family was safe, cared for, and living comfortably because he had set it up that way long ago. At least he thought so. The more his wealth grew, the greater the distance grew between him and the people who once held his world together. Assistants ran his personal errands for him. His team filtered everything that reached him, and Adrian trusted them blindly. He told himself he would reconnect when things slowed down. But life at the top never slowed. It only demanded more. Yet something had begun gnawing at him, small inconsistencies. Messages that weren't answered. Bills he didn't recognize. He brushed them off, too busy to question these little signs that all wasn't right. Then came a call that didn't sound like the others. A shaky voice. A location he hadn't heard in years. A tone that suggested urgency, fear, and something like guilt. He was, without realizing it, on his journey to the darkest truth of his life. One that had been hidden for years, buried beneath the very success he had grown to believe would save his family. Adrian meandered his car through streets he once knew inside out, but everything felt different now. Colder, harsher, stripped of the warmth he remembered. The call had given him an address but no explanation. Yet, as he approached the neighborhood where he grew up, a heaviness settled in his chest. The buildings were worn, the sidewalks cracked, and the air carried the quiet exhaustion of people who had stopped expecting help from anyone. He had parked the car near an alley and noticed the curious eyes that followed his car's every move. A luxury car did not belong here, and neither, it would appear, did he. A group of teenagers whispered to one another, their stares a mixture of suspicion and resignation. Adrian wasn't used to that sort of stare anymore, having forgotten what it felt like to be judged before speaking a word. He walked, starting to see signs he wished he could ignore. A notice plastered crookedly across a door, a power line sagging low, a woman hugging her child closer as a patrol car slowed down beside her. The police officer inside didn't say a word, but his eyes did. Cold, measuring, a look Adrian once knew all too well. He kept going. On the corner, he saw a small group of people clustered around two sanitation workers. It was something in the way they were standing, not looking directly at him, that made his skin tighten. One of them leaned uncomfortably as Adrian asked if an incident had occurred in the neighborhood. The man hesitated, as if deciding whether telling the truth would cost something. Finally, he pointed toward the alley. Adrian stepped in. The smell hit him first, stale food, damp cardboard, the sour smell of places forgotten by everyone who claimed to care. He moved cautiously, his heart thudding hard enough to echo in his ears. A rustle, a whisper, and then he saw two figures bending over a dumpster, their movements slow, their bodies small against the towering heap of discarded items. The frail hand of an elderly woman shook as it raised a container. A little girl shivered under an oversized coat. For a moment, Adrian's breath simply stopped. Not because he didn't recognize them, but because he did. His mother, his daughter. But before he could step forward, a voice cut through the alley. "Leave that. You people don't belong here." A man stood with his arms across his chest, partially blocking the way out, his apron suggesting he was the store owner. Disgust clouded his face. the kind that didn't require words to convey. Adrian instinctively moved toward his family, but the man stepped closer, assuming Adrian was just like them, another problem to push out of sight. It struck him then, nobody here knew he was a billionaire. Nobody saw the success, the headlines, the empire. They only saw a black man in an alley. His mother stiffened, recognizing the tone before she recognized him. She clutched the child protectively, bracing for the kind of confrontation she had endured too many times. Adrian opened his mouth to speak, but a second voice shouted from behind him. Another man, another threat. Then, in a trice, the alley closed in. The truth was here, closer than ever, but so was something else. Something dangerous. Adrian stepped closer, heart hammering, as his mother's eyes widened not with recognition at first, but with fear. The man in the apron sneered, stepped forward as if the presence of Adrian meant nothing. Around them, the alleyway felt smaller and heavier, as if the air itself pressed down on them. The little girl clung to her grandmother, shivering not just from cold but from the heaviness of a world that already told her she didn't belong. "Get out!" The man spat, his voice sharp and edged with hate. "You don't deserve to be here." Adrian froze, as inside his chest, rage and helplessness collided. He could show his wealth, his power, his influence, but none of that mattered here. None of it could erase the years of neglect, the day-to-day humiliation his family had endured, the systemic cruelty that had driven them into hiding. His mother's shaking hand clutched tighter around the girl, a silent entreaty that pierced him deeper than any insult. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but words failed him. Instead, he knelt slowly, meeting his mother's eyes. There was a flicker of recognition there, fragile like a light. She whispered his name, the sound trembling in disbelief. His daughter peeked over her shoulder, her eyes wide, unsure if this was real or another test life had thrown at them. Then the man laughed, cruel and cutting. "You think showing up changes anything? You don't know what this world has done to them, or to you." Adrian's fists tightened, but he didn't budge. His world had shattered, but in the ruins of this broken world was something undeniable, the truth he had avoided all along. The injustice, the neglect, the hate, now it was all exposed in front of him. Standing over those he loved most, Adrian knew then that the fight had only just begun, and life would never be the same again. The alley was silent, except for a single question. How could he undo years of cruelty when the world had already written its story for them? Adrian took his mother and daughter into his arms as the weight of years of absence and ignorance crushed him. The alley had been a source of fear and shame a moment before, but it now held the quiet truth he could no longer avoid. He had chased success for so long, believing money would protect them, that he had forgotten the simplest, most vital thing: presence, care, and recognition. Over the days that followed, Adrian continued to change their lives, not just with wealth, but by fighting to expose a system that made them all so vulnerable, outing the individuals who turned a blind eye, and sharing an open-hearted truth about how many families like his suffer every day. Bruises of neglect, both seen and unseen, were left far deeper than anything money could erase, but his acknowledgement, his voice, was a small act of justice. He now knew that genuine reform is not just about acts of individual kindness. It's about challenging the structures that allow discrimination, poverty, and racial injustice to fester silently in plain sight. His mom and daughter no longer had to hide, but the world around them still needed waking. Adrian's wealth and influence could magnify a message that so many powerless voices could not. Dignity, respect, and equality cannot wait for someone else to care. And as he looked at them, safe, yet marked by struggle, he knew his story was not his alone. It's the story of millions of families torn apart by prejudice and indifference. And so, one is left with the question hanging in the air. How many more lives are camouflaged among the surroundings, waiting for someone to see them, fight for them, demand justice before it's too late? It wasn't just the end of Adrian's journey. It was a call, a challenge for all of us to look, to listen, and to act.